All right, so where we left off the other day was discussing the evolution of American federalism. And I believe we had gone from the starting point of the Articles of Confederation to the collapse of Reconstruction after 1876. All right, so we go through a stage then in American politics from about 1876 to about 1932, in which we see the reassertion of states' rights and the relative decline in the power of the national government, right? So this ongoing reshaping of American federalism. Where we pick up today is with the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then we're going to take that right up to the present. All right, so next up, the New Deal. So the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt elected to the White House circa 1932, running against the incumbent Herbert Hoover. We were in the midst of the Great Depression. Hoover's basic idea is to stick with a relatively free market economy, keep the national government very small and very hands-off. That's ultimately seen as unenlightened, as maybe just wrong-headed thinking. And so we, the people, do elect FDR. FDR experiments with a wide variety of national governmental programs designed to get the economy back on its feet, to get the country back on its feet. I think unemployment at one point under the Great Depression as high as 25%, pretty remarkable. So we get a big shift here in our politics. FDR is elected, reelected, 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 dies. Democrats elected to large majorities in both houses of Congress over and over again. So things are changing fast politically. And what happens then? We get the New Deal, a wide variety of executive branch programs designed to get the economy back on its feet. This becomes really the beginnings of the modern welfare state. This is happening in other countries as well, but this is the American version of that. Here's where we get most notably Social Security. We get a variety of other programs as well. The Tennessee Valley Authority to develop a good chunk of the Midwest here via the use of water power, hydroelectric power, the electrification of a lot of farms. This is where really we jumpstart into the modern era as a nation state. And so we get out of this a much expanded national government, much more involved in the economy, much more involved in the lives of the American people. We get the creation of a very significant welfare state that over time gets significantly larger yet. So this is a key moment. This is really the watershed moment in the history of American federalism. This is where we develop this large welfare state, a large executive branch bureaucracy, right? The president is the chief executive of that bureaucracy, and Congress creates it and funds it. So a dramatic expansion, and so far it's been a permanent expansion of the power of the national government. Occurring at about the same time, albeit just a little bit later, is the massive fact of World War II, and then of course the aftermath of World War II. What happens post World War II? The U.S. emerges, has their Keynesian era, if you will, as a global superpower. This is really their coming out party, as it were. They are now, without question, a global superpower, set off against, of course, the other global superpower, the Soviet Union. It is now a bipolar world, if you will, two major powers dominating global politics. So what does this mean for the United States? It means a much stronger executive branch, because who tends to dominate foreign policy? Without a doubt, the president. Right? Congress has the power to declare war, but who are we kidding? What really matters is the power to wage war. That's in the hands of the commander-in-chief of the military. That is the United States president. So in a variety of ways, the very fact that we become a global superpower means that we have a very powerful presidency that deals with foreign policy, and that greatly strengthens the executive branch, the presidency. And the presidency is part of our national government, so as a result, right, we have a much stronger national government. This is part of this tectonic shift in the shape of American federalism, and right up to the present, these have been two permanent changes. A much expanded welfare state managed by the president, um, funded by Congress, often expanded by Congress, established by Congress, and then, of course, the emergence of America as a global superpower, headed up by the president. Again, there are structural forces in play here that reshape American federalism. And right up to the present, right, that's still pretty much the deal in terms of the U.S. as a global superpower, and now largely unopposed by any other major superpower. Um, and of course, we have a much expanded welfare state. The New Deal was just the beginning. All forces that favor a stronger national government, right up to the present. Next up, once again, we see a dramatic expansion in the power of the national government. We see that via LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency. We've talked about some of that already, right? He led the charge for the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. What did those laws do? They limited the power of state governments to behave badly on the issue of race, and it strengthened the ability of Congress to deal with these issues from a national point of view, from a federal point of view. So that becomes very significant right there. But on top of that, right, Lyndon B. Johnson was an ambitious son of a gun. He also proposed what he called his Great Society programs, most notably perhaps let me get this right. I think both Medicare and Medicaid, right? So heavily subsidized medical care for the elderly and for the poor. Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor. These become, over time, huge programs, right? The two largest domestic programs today, entitlement programs, if you meet the definition, you get the benefits, Social Security and Medicare. Social Security rooted in the New Deal, Medicare rooted in LBJ's Great Society. So his Great Society, right, gets, again, the national government much more involved in the everyday lives of the American people. LBJ helps, along with Congress, to dramatically expand the welfare state. And so we get out of that, no question about it, a much stronger national government. We might also throw into that mix the Vietnam War. It is under LBJ that we thoroughly Americanized that war. No longer just a few hundred or a few thousand advisors. Now it ends up peaking, I think, at over 500,000 troops sent to Vietnam as part of that Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so once LBJ expands that war, again, right, who does that favor? The executive branch, the presidency, that's the national government. So to the extent that LBJ leads the charge in the Vietnam War, to the extent that he Americanizes that war, that expands the power of the national government once again. Although we'll see that once, as things start to go badly in Vietnam, that results in a backlash that ultimately, for a while at least, limits the power of the presidency. Talk about that perhaps in just a moment. What's up next here? The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. But just before that, I mean, what happens in Vietnam? As I suggested just a moment ago, things start to go badly under LBJ. Ultimately, the media becomes more critical of that war effort. They start to question the storyline being given us by the LBJ administration and then the Nixon administration. The American people start to turn against that war. It looks more and more unwinnable. LBJ had always said privately that it was an unwinnable war. He just didn't want to lose it on his watch. So he Americanized it to the extent that he thought he had to avoid losing. He never thought winning was a realistic possibility. His analysis, as pretty much always, was right on. The guy was a political genius. So in a sense, right, in a very real sense, we do lose that war. We pull out. We essentially admit a certain amount of defeat in Vietnam. And that results in, for a few years, a smaller presidency, especially once Nixon resigns the White House during the Watergate scandal. So we do have, for a while, a reduced presidency, right, after the loss in Vietnam, the resignation of Nixon, the rise to power of Gerald Ford, a pretty weak president, understandably so. The environment created a weak presidency. Deep skepticism about the presidency, concerns about what had been perhaps an imperial presidency. Next up, Jimmy Carter. wearing his little cardigans, carrying his own luggage, turning down the thermostat in the White House to save energy, right? A reduced presidency. So I suppose for a few years we do get, in some ways, a smaller national government. But what happens very soon after? Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980. He says that it's morning again in America. How do we restart America? How do we recover after some of what had gone before, right? Watergate, Vietnam, the Carter presidency, the energy crises, all of that. We grow the military and we cut federal taxes. Reagan wants to shrink the national government, at least rhetorically, that's what he says, shrink the national government and reinvigorate state government. Reverse some of those longer trends that we've talked about, things like the New Deal, the Great Society, the emergence of America as a global superpower. He essentially says, in some ways, let's reverse some of those trends and reinvigorate states and recommit to limiting the power of the national government. But right off, we know that, hey, there's an inconsistency there. We're going to grow the military, grow it dramatically. Fine, that's entirely defensible, so to speak. It might be the right choice. It helps arguably to defeat the Soviet Union in that Cold War. It leads to us becoming the world's lone superpower. But when you grow the military, what are you doing? You're growing the executive branch. You're growing the power of the national government. That's fine, but that's not the same as shrinking the national government. That's the opposite. It's growing the national government. So again, even though there's some rhetoric about shrinking the national government, in practice, exactly the opposite happens. What else does Reagan propose here? He had two main agenda items, right, as president: grow the military so that we could stand tall again, and lower federal taxes. He also achieved much of that, right, the lowering of federal taxes, although later on in his presidency, he did ultimately help to raise those taxes once again. But at least for a while, we do lower federal taxes. So we're lowering federal taxes, reducing federal revenue at the same time that we're dramatically growing the military, and at the same time that Congress is still mostly under the control of Democrats, and then later Democrats and moderate Republicans. And so domestic spending continues to increase as well. Not just spending on the military, but also spending on other sorts of domestic programs. So spending doesn't go down, spending goes up. In some ways it goes up dramatically because of the growth of the military. Federal taxes go down, revenue goes down. What does that mean? This is when we start to run some of those very large deficits, right? We need to borrow money now, print more currency in order to cover the deficit. So that happens here under President Ronald Reagan and with the participation of the U.S. Congress. So again, right, rhetorically, Reagan is saying one thing, but in some ways, in terms of actual political practice, doing something a little bit different. Are we really shrinking the national government? Heck no. In some ways, we're growing it and growing it quite dramatically. So that trend really does continue in terms of actual political practice under Ronald Reagan. But he does begin to change the conversation. I would say that rhetorically, and words matter in politics, they matter a great deal. He begins to shift the conversation in a way that begins to recognize maybe we have gone too far with the Great Society programs. Maybe we do need to cut back a little bit and reinvigorate state governments. And so there are things happening politically that do help to reinvigorate state governments, including Supreme Court decisions that start to limit some of the powers of Congress under the Commerce Clause, and they begin to reinvigorate state governments to some extent. So that is happening. But the larger story in some ways is, in some ways, quite the opposite. The national government continues to grow in size and power. But states are also getting reinvigorated here as well. We should note that. And Reagan is beginning to shift the conversation in ways that will pay off, ironically perhaps, under, well, let's mention that right now. You begin to get some of the payoff on that rhetoric, especially with none other than President William Jefferson Clinton. Right under William Jefferson Clinton, we do begin to get a smaller national government. We do begin to balance the budget once again. I think the last time we balanced the federal budget was under the leadership of President Clinton, with an important role played by the U.S. Congress, which at that time was often led by Republicans like Bob Dole and Newt Gingrich. Um, but we're also beginning to get welfare reform. We're beginning to shrink with the welfare state a little bit under Clinton. And Clinton just does a number of things, right? Because he ran as a new kind of Democrat, as not Jimmy Carter, not not George McGovern, not Michael Dukakis, not Walter Mondale, not a liberal, but a centrist, willing to work with both parties, take middle centrist kinds of positions. And so we do get some of the payoff of the Reagan rhetoric about reinventing American federalism. In terms of actual political practice, we get a lot of that under President Clinton, his 8 years in office. So to the extent that we do see a real reshaping of federalism in very real ways in terms of political practice, much more under Clinton than under Reagan. But let's be clear about this. Reagan sets the stage for that with some of his reshaping of the national dialogue over that issue. All right, so that's what's happening under President Ronald Reagan, and then Bush the Elder, and then Bill Clinton. Next up, a new era in American federalism. Many thought perhaps George W. Bush. Perhaps we're going to continue in the direction begun by Reagan, facilitated and continued by Bush the Elder, and then really a lot of payoff with the presidency of Bill Clinton. Gore loses that 2000 election narrowly to George W. Bush, wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College. Many believe that W. Bush would continue and even accelerate this reshaping of American federalism. Not so, as we know, of course, not so at all. The first thing we get out of the Bush presidency is bipartisan legislation on education, No Child Left Behind. And what does that do? It gets the federal government much more involved in the issue of education than had ever been the case before in American history, right? Because historically, K through 12 public education had been mostly the domain of state and local government. Here we get the feds involved to a very high degree. So what does that mean for federalism? A much stronger national government on an issue that historically had been more the domain of state and local government. 9/11 happens, of course, the tragedy of 9/11, the terror attacks. Out of that, of course, what happens? A much stronger presidency, the creation of the largest bureaucracy, I believe, in the history of planet Earth, the Department of Homeland Security. I believe over 100,000 employees of Homeland Security. An increase in executive secrecy, right? The president's domination of the war on terror. So very basic structural forces right on the global level are heavily favoring a much more powerful national government, and in particular, of course, a much more powerful executive branch. A fact of what we talked about before, right? We are a global superpower, the only global superpower, and then we're under attack by terrorists. That's going to heavily favor a much stronger presidency, a much stronger national government. And what does Bush do as well in the run up to the 2004 election cycle, where he's hoping to get reelected for a second term? His popularity has gone down quite a bit, right? The shine of 9/11 has worn off. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are not going very well. And his political director, Karl Rove, a Machiavellian genius, says, "Look, Bush, how do you make sure that you win this 2004 election against John Kerry? Let's expand Medicare. Let's get the feds much more involved in providing health care for elderly Americans. Who votes most reliably? The elderly. How do they tend to vote these days? Republican. Let's reward that constituency, encourage that constituency, mobilize that constituency. Let's get the feds to pay a lot more for prescription drug benefits. Let's expand that dramatically." Congress goes along, Democrat and Republican. This definitely helps Bush win that very close election. But what does that do, right? It makes Medicare a much larger program. What is Medicare? It's a federal program to provide health benefits for the elderly. This grows, again, the power of the national government. And of course, in order to make all of this happen, the war against terror, the expansion of Medicare, No Child Left Behind, this requires a lot of money. And we're not really willing to raise revenue enough to fund that, of course, and so we continue to run absolutely massive budget deficits um, that definitely help to facilitate the creation of a much stronger national government. It's got to be paid for somehow. We essentially pay for it by borrowing against the future, something that we still struggle with today, of course. Okay, so this is what happens, right, under the presidency of W. Bush, not a continued reshaping of American federalism in the direction of state power and against national power, but in many ways quite the opposite. Even before 9/11, with No Child Left Behind, but certainly after 9/11, no matter who was president, that's what we were going to see, right? A much stronger presidency, a much stronger national government, plus Medicare thrown into the mix. So you get it. All right, so if we're tracking the shape of federalism since W. Bush was president, which to me doesn't seem that long ago, but was obviously for you guys a very long time ago indeed. The national government, right, has continued to grow apace. Uh, States continue to do just fine, although I'm going to talk about that in sort of a variable way in just a moment. And if we're really going to bemoan any level of government in terms of their place in the power structure, it might be local governments, which it seems increasingly are being sort of governed by state policy that puts limits on local autonomy. We've seen that most obviously with gun control in red states, where state legislatures are telling local governments, right, which are typically big cities that are blue, right, run by Democrats who want gun control, but within a red state like Texas or Florida, right, the state is saying, no, you can't do that. We're going to set a state policy on gun control. So I think, depending sort of on the state and the situation and the politics of the moment, local governments have probably been restrained more than either state or the national government in terms of power. Yeah, President Obama, right? We got things like the Affordable Care Act, and I think the Troubled Asset Relief Program, although that might actually have been under W. Bush at the very end of his second term, maybe more of the stimulus program, right? A much stronger role for the national government in healthcare policy and the economy under Obama. Under Trump, right? Trump 1.0, same basic trend. Trump really never promised us a rose garden, right? He never said, I'm hardcore about devolving power to the state level, because that would mean surrendering national power when he's part of the national government. So Trump said, let's grow the executive branch, especially, and make it increasingly powerful and constrain the behavior of blue states, perhaps, and constrain the power of red states less because of those politics, right, which for Trump are deeply personal. Um, Trump also, right, to his great credit, played a key role in promoting and helping to bring about an effective, actually multiple effective COVID vaccines, which meant a strong role for the national government in healthcare policy. I think history will judge him well on that in particular, maybe not so well on other things, but that for sure. President Biden, right, the same thing. Uh, a lot of legislation that he helped push through Congress in his first 2 years when Democrats controlled both chambers. Lots of stimulus programs, infrastructure programs, microchip industry promotion, all sorts of major legislation that expanded the power of the national government under Biden, and under Trump 2.0, first 4 or 5 months, right? An ongoing acceleration of national government power, executive branch power in particular, right? As Trump 2.0 tries to crowd out the power of Congress uh, through executive orders and Doge. So yeah, and what are we having on this coming weekend? Right, a big military parade in Washington D.C. that promotes the power of the national government, specifically the U.S. military under the leadership of the president as commander in chief. Don't cry for the states. I see some of you getting a tear out there in TV land. Don't cry for the states. For the most part, states are doing just fine alongside the growth of the national government. Although again, especially with Trump, right? He's really targeting blue states like California, trying to limit their autonomy as much as possible and sort of dictate how they do things, but giving red states a lot more autonomy. So that's an interesting twist in how federalism works. Again, because of Trump's deeply personal view of politics, you promote your allies and punish your enemies. And for him, right, enemies would be blue states like California, New York, Illinois, etc. And you maximize the power of red states, Texas, Florida, etc. All right, I'm going to leave it there.